You're listening to episode number 8 of Liz's Healthy Table.
Looking for a healthy new way to feed your family without the hassle and hype? Welcome to Liz's Healthy Table, where your host, registered dietitian nutritionist Liz Weiss, serves up fresh and flavorful recipes with a tasty side of science, good nutrition, and fun. Are you and your family ready for some wholesome food that tastes great too? Don't change that dial. Your food adventure starts here.
Welcome to the show, everybody. Today, I will be talking with Chris Vogliano. He's a registered dietitian and the ethical food warrior. He's got a passion for creating a sustainable and waste-free food system that's healthy for people and the planet. Did you know that according to the USDA that nearly 40% of all the food produced in the United States never makes it into your stomach or mine? It goes to waste. And of course, that's a waste of money. It's a waste of resources like water, the water used to help plants grow, and the fuel needed to transport those plants from the farm ultimately to your dinner table. So Chris is going to guide us through 3 big things that we can do starting today to eat more sustainably. And if you've ever wondered what all those sell-by dates mean and all those use-by and the best-by dates, well, Chris is going to be here to explain. In preparation for the show, I actually shopped my refrigerator and I put together a cheese omelet with slow roasted tomatoes. So good. So I'm going to share that recipe with you today. And Chris has some tasty ideas up his sleeve as well, like a crockpot concoction that turns leftovers into dinner with little to no prep. Chris's website is chrisvogliano.com, and I'll be sure to share that link to his website and all the resources and recipes that we talk about today. I'll share it in my show notes. So if you head on over to lizshealthytable.com, hit up the podcast page, you can then check out the show notes. And by the way, when you're on that page, look in the right-hand sidebar, you'll see an invitation to join my podcast posse. It's over on Facebook. It's a closed Facebook group, but just head on over, click join, and I will welcome you with open arms. Before we get started today, I just would love to thank my sponsors, starting with Zespri Kiwi Fruit. They are the global leader in premium quality kiwi fruit. They've got these beautiful sun gold kiwi fruits. They are kind of special because they have this tropical sweet taste and a smooth, hairless skin. They're juicy. They're yellow. We think of kiwis as green, and they are, but this is a different type of kiwi. So sweet, so delicious. Just slice it in half and literally scoop it out with a spoon. Great for a snack. They are available in supermarkets across the country. You can learn more at zesprikiwi.com. I also would like to thank Bush's Beans. Now, talk about sustainability. Beans are grown sustainably. Chris is going to tell us more about that today. And so they fit right in with everything we're going to talk about today. So if you want to eat like an ethical food warrior, head on over to bushbeans.com. They come in so many varieties. I use beans all the time, so check them out. And finally, I would like to thank Super Healthy Kids. They are my good buddies online. They have so many recipes on their website, superhealthykids.com. They have an amazing blog, so if you need any recipe under the sun for your family, obviously come to my website, but head on over to Super Healthy Kids as well. So I am so excited for today's guest because I'm really passionate myself about food waste or reducing food waste. And there are really a lot of easy things we can do. We just need to be a little bit more mindful. We need a little bit of a plan, but it's so easy to reduce your food waste and eat more sustainably. So welcome, Chris, to Liz's Healthy Table.
Hey, thanks so much, Liz, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have you. So tell me, Chris, what does it mean to be an ethical food warrior? Who are you? What are you all about? Tell everybody about yourself.
Yeah, I get that question often, and it's pretty simple, Liz. It's about just asking the question, where does our food come from? And it's thinking beyond just the fork, but having the mentality of farm to fork and understanding that there are implications to grow in our food. And some foods have a more sustainable track record than others. And as consumers, I feel that we have the power to make these choices every single day and can actually make a difference in our own lives and the lives of others around us.
We hear this statistic that 40% of our food is wasted. That is so shocking to me. I'm sure when our parents were growing up, back in the day, that didn't happen. Food is inexpensive. It's easy to access, but yet we're wasting it. 40% is so staggering to me.
It is. And you're right, actually. In the 1970s, we produced half of the amount of food waste that we do now. So it's actually doubled since the 1970s. And part of that is the abundance of food that we have available to us, but also the price. It's actually pretty affordable in America to buy food compared to other countries. So it's almost a disposable good, if you will, for many. And we don't even think about throwing it away. But 40% is a significant amount, as you said.
How much money do we waste, though, every year when we literally waste 40% of our food?
Yeah, well, the stats that I've read are around a family of four wastes around $190 a month on food waste alone. So that adds up pretty quickly, especially if you're working with low-income families or trying to be on a budget. That is a pretty significant source of money.
Wow. And, when food is wasted, let's say by going to a landfill, why is that bad? I said at the beginning of the show that it's bad for people to waste food, but it's also bad for the planet. So what kind of gases, if you will, are emitted to the atmosphere when we waste food?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question. So this kind of gets back to my point of thinking from farm to fork. By the time we buy the food, let's say, a piece of produce that may end up going bad, by the time we buy that food, there is so much energy, resources, labor, and love that have gone into growing that food that therefore, if we throw it away, that we're wasting. So, all of the water, all of the fossil fuels and fertilizers that go into growing that food. But then, as you mentioned, once it enters the landfill, if we're not composting it and just tossing it in the garbage, it actually rots and creates gas called methane. And methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide, which accelerates climate change very, very fast.
Yikes. So we really want to focus on wasting less, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Just this one question I have, and that is, the show that I'm doing today is all about eating sustainably. And when we say eating sustainably, how would you define that exactly? Because we toss this term around a lot. So I really want to define it for people.
Yeah, sustainable diets is a very, very broad term and one that many experts around the world are still trying to figure out the exact definition of. But personally, I feel that the FAO, or Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, has a really good definition. So bear with me. It's about 2 sentences, but I think it sums up sustainable diets very, very well. They say that sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. They are culturally acceptable and accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally dense, and safe, all while optimizing natural and human resources. So as you can imagine, that's a pretty broad definition, but I think it encompasses sustainability quite well when it comes to diets.
So let's kind of dig into the weeds a little bit then, Chris. Let's talk about these 3 things, 3 pillars, plant-based proteins, eating more of those, reducing food waste, and then eating a more biodiverse diet. So let's start with plant-based proteins. When we tell people, eat more plant proteins, what are we talking about here? Yeah,
plant proteins actually, for the most part, take a significantly less amount of resources to grow in the first place. So there's less fertilizer, there's less fossil fuels, significantly less water that goes into growing these foods that offer a similar protein profile as many of the meat counterparts. So we know in research that eating more predominantly plant-based diet can be beneficial to our health, but it's also pretty cool that eating a more predominantly plant-based diet can actually be better for the environment too.
So when you talk about plants, so I mentioned beans at the top of the show. Beans are pulses. Lentils are pulses. So that kind of thing. We're talking about beans, lentils, tofu, that kind of stuff. Is that where we're going with this?
You got it. Yeah, there are so many plant-based options out there. As you said, lentils, which are in and of themselves worth a shout out because they are nitrogen fixers, and they actually help pull nitrogen from the air and fixate it into the soil, which helps actually reduce our carbon footprint. So not only are they efficient protein, but they're really, really good for the environment. Also, eggs are a great source. I know they're not vegan or vegetarian, but they actually are a very low footprint when it comes to protein. We also have a variety of nuts and seeds that are great. Tofu, as you mentioned, and even some whole grains such as farro, quinoa, teff. Those are all high in protein and much more sustainable than some meat counterparts.
What if you love beef, for example? Like, we always hear that beef has this very big carbon footprint. Is that an urban legend, or is that really based on sound science? So how much beef do we eat as a nation, and should we be eating less? And if so, why?
So I get that question all the time. And actually, it is pretty true that beef does have a very high carbon and water footprint. The amount of food that goes into raising a pound of beef could feed 7 to 8 times as many people if we were to use a plant-based protein instead. And that's just simply because cows are not very efficient converters of food, i.e., corn to animal product. It's a very low efficiency rate. Also, if you're someone who enjoys beef, I am by no means telling anyone to stop eating meat or beef if that's something that you enjoy to do. However, right now, Americans are consuming way more beef than we need. The standard American diet, 25% of our standard American diet is made up from animal foods, whereas only 12% of the standard American diet is made up of plant-based foods. The rest of it is accounted for by processed foods, which we can all agree is, we can probably scale back there too. But since the conversation is around animal foods, I would say that scales are a little bit unbalanced for the average American right now.
So I love red meat, and I eat it occasionally. And I'm telling you, when I get a great steak, I am so happy. But what I tend to do is I eat smaller portions. So I eat it sort of more as a special occasion food, and I choose smaller portions. So if you love beef, you're saying you don't need to give it up. You don't need to feel guilty. Just eat less of it and then focus more on the plant foods just because they require fewer resources, if you will.
Absolutely. And, I always say just give your meals a plant slant. Instead of having a steak every night, maybe work some fish in there. Instead of having beef tacos one night, try having fish tacos or even black bean tacos. You can still have many of your favorite dishes, but maybe substituting some or all of the meat out for that meal and trying a plant-based variety. But as you said, if you enjoy beef, by all means, have beef, but don't make it the center of your plate. Use it as a condiment. Use it to flavor as a side ingredient and not the main star of the plate. And that will actually be healthier for you and the planet as well.
What about these blended burgers that we keep hearing about? Tell everybody what's a blended burger.
I love this. The Blended Burger Project is a collaboration between the James Beard Foundation and the Mushroom Council. And essentially what they've done is they've ground 50% ground beef and 50% mushrooms together and made a really juicy and delicious burger that many people have been raving about. I know that Sodexo has introduced this into some of their cafeterias. Sodexo is a food service company, and they've introduced this to their cafeterias, and people have been loving it. It's juicy, it's tender, it has that umami flavor from the mushrooms, but it actually is cutting your footprint technically in half because of the beef reduction.
So you have a beef burger, but you've got half mushrooms. And you could do that with black beans too. You can mash up some black beans and then incorporate that into a burger. So you're not using as much of the beef, right?
Exactly.
I've done that before.
Best of both worlds, exactly. Yeah, you get the fiber and some of the phytonutrients from the beans, but also you get that taste of the beef if that's really what you're after.
Is there something you love to do with lentils, like a recipe, or with beans? Like, what's kind of your go-to? Like, I'll tell you my go-to. So my go-to with beans is simply like quesadillas. I just take flour tortillas, and then I add a little bit of like barbecue sauce, because I'm like in love with the Trader Joe's barbecue sauce. It's all natural. A little bit of barbecue sauce. I add some black beans, or it might be pinto beans. And then I add sauteed bell peppers and lots of cilantro, because I love cilantro, and then a little bit of shredded cheese. And I fold it in half, and then I just cook it in a skillet for a few minutes on each side till the flour tortillas get really crispy and that cheese inside melts into the beans. And so it's like a 5-minute dinner. And it's plant-based. And you know what? If you had steak for dinner the night before and you've got leftovers, and maybe you're shopping your refrigerator, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, you could slice that up and add that as well. So that's kind of my go-to when it comes to adding, say, more pulses to the diet.
That sounds delicious. And now you have me hungry. So,
And what's your go-to?
Sure. I love cooking with my crock pot. I'm very busy. I'm always on the go. And the crock pot is really an easy way for me to meal prep throughout my week. So actually on Sunday evenings is when I usually use my crock pot, but I always include lentils. I use a variety of, and we'll probably talk about this later, anything that's in my refrigerator, I'll generally throw in the crock pot. It's a pretty blank palette. But I always add lentils. I always add some sort of vegetable, such as potatoes, sweet potatoes, or corn. And then I also like to add a grain, too, just to balance it out in there. So I usually throw some quinoa in there and finish it off with a sauce, such as a pasta sauce or a cashew-based sauce. The options are really endless. And since there are so many different types of pulses or, lentils and beans, I really don't get bored of lentils ever.
And so you add the dried lentils. They hydrate as they're cooking. Do you add like a vegetable broth and make it more soupy?
Absolutely, yeah. You definitely need to add some sort of broth in there to allow the lentils to soak up that liquid. And I usually do use a vegetable broth, yes.
Mm-hmm. That sounds really good. And then you could top that with Parmesan cheese. If you've got other leftovers in the fridge, you can pop that in too. Why not?
Absolutely. And, I always like to throw in mixed greens or spinach or even kale onto the top of my crock pot because those just, break down so easily and incorporate the flavors and the texture really, really well into the crock pot. And then you're getting your greens, too.
Oh, so the greens are in there as everything's cooking. The greens are cooking with it.
Absolutely.
Love that. I'm going to try that. Thank you. So plant-based diets. Let's move on. And by the way, for those of you listening, I did a show with Sharon Palmer a while back, and she is the plant-powered dietitian. And so we talked a lot about eating plant-based diets. So definitely want to tune into that. So I've had the plant-powered dietitian on the show. And today we have the ethical food warrior. So we're just so lucky. So food waste. This is huge, right? So we know, again, 40% of our food from the farm to our forks goes to waste, partly because food is so accessible. It's so inexpensive, and we kind of take it for granted. So you got to change your mindset, and we have to start thinking about cutting back on food waste. I will tell you my number one biggest frustration and challenge is strawberries. I buy them, and before we finish them, they get moldy, and it's driving me crazy. And so I really have to keep a watchful eye on my strawberries and then wash them and freeze what I don't use. I just slice them up, and then we could use them in smoothies. Is there another trick to keeping strawberries fresh?
You actually just hit the nail on the head. Anytime I see my fruit that is potentially going to be molding in the next few days, I always just rinse them off and throw them in the freezer because I love using them for smoothies. And I actually prefer frozen fruit in my smoothies more than fresh fruit because it gives that smoothie a better consistency. So I really have eliminated my fruit food waste by just freezing it.
Okay, good stuff. So you had a really amazing blog post, and I'm going to link to it in my show notes. It was 8 ways to reduce your food waste food print today instead of footprint, food print. And you had 8 tips. The first was to shop the fridge. And I sort of talked about that a little bit before. But, do people tend to sort of forget what's in their fridge and then they go to the store and they sort of keep buying stuff without taking stock of what's already on hand?
Absolutely. I'm guilty of it too. I mean, we all are. And we'd be lying if we said we weren't. But it's easy to forget what's in your fridge, especially in the far back corner where you're not really looking all the time. But every time I go to the grocery store now, I just snap a photo of my open fridge so I know exactly what's in it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts or questioning. I'm at the grocery store and I know, I do actually have some extra kale and I do have some tomatoes left over, so I don't need to buy these. So making a list or taking a picture, documenting it somehow is a very effective way to prevent over purchasing foods that you don't need.
That's a great tip. I love that. Take a photo. I do that when I go shopping at the supermarket and I forget where my car is parked. So I will often take a photo. I don't know about you, but I go to the grocery store. I'm so focused on getting in there, getting out. I've got my list and I walk out, I'm like, oh my gosh, where's my car? So just, you can use your camera to your advantage there as well. Eating leftovers. Some people don't love leftovers. They say, oh, that's too boring. I don't want leftovers. So what do you say for people who are bored with leftovers? How do you change that up?
I would say I agree with you, first off. Sometimes don't like eating leftovers either. But leftovers, as you said, do not have to be boring. You can remake your leftovers or have a leftover makeover, if you will, and use your leftovers as an ingredient for a new meal. For instance, if I have a leftover stir fry or even leftover food from a restaurant that I'm like, you had that yesterday, I don't want to eat it again, I will incorporate that into a new meal, such as taking leftover curry from a Thai restaurant that I had the night before and adding more vegetables, adding some tofu, maybe even adding a little bit more sauce if necessary, and just stir frying that up on my stovetop. And next thing you know, you have a brand new meal.
You could do that, folks, with chicken. Like if you buy a rotisserie chicken, that rotisserie chicken one night can become something totally different the next. You could add it to a soup. You could chop it up. You can make a chicken salad. You can make a pasta dish and throw in the diced up chicken to that. So yeah, it can get boring after a while. So you got to get a little creative in the kitchen. Chris, you also talk about studying your trash. What do you mean by that?
I grew up in Ohio where composting was not the norm. But I recently moved to Seattle about 3 years ago, where it is actually illegal to throw away food for consumers or businesses. And we have mandatory composting that is picked up every week on our curbside. So when I moved here, I actually had to readjust my habits. And any food that I would traditionally throw away into the trash can, I now have to throw into a compost bin. And this has taught me a lot about how much food I waste. So that's why I always say study your trash and noticing what you throw out most often and buying less of it in the first place. Maybe we don't need 5 pounds of apples because every time we buy 5 pounds of apples, we're wasting 2 of those pounds. As I mentioned, I moved to Seattle and started composting. I started to identify trends. Like, I don't need this much produce. I don't need this much vegetables because I am cooking just for myself. And oftentimes when you throw it in the trash, it kind of gets mixed in with everything else and you don't see the amount per se. But if you have it separated out or even just start to be more aware of what you're throwing away, you can actually reduce the amount you buy once again.
I have never heard of this. So you're saying curbside, just like they pick up bottles, cans, glass, they pick up compost that the town then puts into this communal compost heap, if you will?
Absolutely. And it's amazing, Liz, because by the time you separate compost and recycling out, the amount of trash you have left over is very, very small. It really has changed my mindset on food waste and on recycling because our garbage bins are actually smaller than our recycling bins and our compost bins.
That is so cool. I did try to compost years ago and I failed abysmally. And I think I just needed a different type of compost bin to have in my backyard, the kind maybe with a crank that you could crank it through. So I kind of failed at that, but maybe one day I'll resurrect that because that's kind of one area where I think I could improve. And it's really just this idea of being more mindful, just paying attention is so important. You also talk in this article, and I'm going to link to it, but one of your other tips is to eat frozen fruits and veggies. So like when you're going to the supermarket, buy frozen peas or buy frozen strawberries. Like people, I feel like frozen food sometimes has a stigma, but you think that's a good thing then? And if so, why?
I do. And oftentimes when we're buying fresh fruit from the store, it is picked long before it's ripened, and then it ripens during its transit to the grocery store. So we're actually not getting the ripest fruits that we actually could be. But when you are buying frozen fruits and frozen veggies, they are picked at their prime ripeness, and then they are flash frozen. And the benefits of those fruits and vegetables are actually preserved through that flash freezing. So I'm a huge advocate of frozen fruits and vegetables. They last much longer. The food waste is very minimal, and they're so easy to use and incorporate into recipes.
And I love things like frozen petite peas. I don't like frozen peas, but when they're the petite peas, I love those. And I like to mix them with frozen corn kernels, add a little olive oil, salt and pepper. It's like a 2-minute easy side dish when you're just making dinner and you're like, what am I going to serve? We've got to have a vegetable. So I always grab for frozen fruits and veggies as well. So that's a great tip. And then what about things like sell by, use by, best by? This drives me crazy because so many people throw food away because they see a date and they think, oh my gosh, I can't eat those eggs. It's going to be bad for my family. And so what really are those dates and what's the unintended consequence of those dates?
This really irks me too because the dates are there for a reason. They're there to show quality, not safety. And that's the big misnomer. In fact, studies have shown that over 90% of consumers throw out food too early because of these dates, because they're confusing. Many consumers aren't aware that these are quality date, and that after this date, the flavor might degrade a little bit. Maybe the texture is a little off, but by no means does that mean food is unsafe to eat. And the U.S. government has identified this as a major issue, but still these dates, the sell by, use by, best of use by, are very confusing. I always recommend people to go to www.stilltasty.com, and you can type in almost any food item, and it will give you the actual safety date of that food item, so you can identify how long you can keep that after the best by, use by, or sell by date.
I actually do the sniff test. And I also look, if something's got like a little mold on it or something, obviously I'm not going to eat it. But, my husband so many times will say, oh, wait a minute, we can't drink the milk because look at this date. No. That was the date for the supermarket to identify like, hey, it's best if we get it on the shelf a little before then. But by no means is the milk bad. I smell it. It smells fine. We drink it.
Yeah, the smell test is really an effective way. And, the other thing I think we should change in our conversation around this is a lot of people will say it's expired. And in fact, there is only one food in America that is required by law to have an expiration date, and that's baby food. But beyond that, there are actually no expiration dates on foods. They'll always say best by or sell by or best if used by. But oftentimes as consumers, we just substitute those words for expired when actually that's not true.
And is it expired for baby food or baby formula?
Baby formula.
Baby formula. Got it. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, so definitely don't get hung up on those dates. And give me the name of that website again that people can go to.
Yeah, it is www.stilltasty.com.
Okay, good. We'll put that in the show notes for sure. Let me tell you about this recipe I made the other day. Actually, I made it this morning. So, it was sort of the other day that I had these cherry and grape tomatoes. And, when you buy grape tomatoes or cherry tomatoes, you've got a lot of tomatoes because they always come like in a pint. And sometimes we don't finish them. So this is my new favorite go-to. So what I do is I take the tomatoes and I slice them in half lengthwise, put them in a bowl, and then add a little bit of olive oil and salt and pepper. And then if you've got some fresh herbs, either in your fridge or maybe you've got them in the garden, you could just chop up some fresh thyme or fresh rosemary and then toss it all together. And then you lay those tomatoes on a baking sheet. I always put foil down first or parchment, just it's easier for cleanup. And you put them cut side up. So now you've got all your tomatoes there. And then you place them in a 225-degree oven for 3 hours. And it slow roasts the tomatoes. It essentially dehydrates them. And when they come out of the oven, they literally taste like candy. They almost sort of taste like sun-dried tomatoes. I'm telling you, it's just like heavenly. So I did this the other day. And then I had them in my fridge this morning. So I made an omelet. It was a cheese omelet. So I had some sliced mozzarella cheese in the fridge and I want to use that up. So that's for sandwiches this week. But I said, okay, I'm going to take a slice of that. Took an egg, just whisked it up, beat the egg, and then just cooked it in a skillet. Added that slice of cheese, added those beautiful slow roasted tomatoes, folded it over, and then you could grab a piece of whole wheat bread or you've got, half of a English muffin, whatever you have. This would be good on a little naan bread as well. And now I've got this really yummy omelet with these gorgeous slow roasted tomatoes. And so it's a good way to use up the tomatoes that you have sitting there that you're like, oh no, not more tomatoes in my salad. And it's just great. And then I just keep them in the fridge. And then you could add them to salads. You could add them to pasta. I'm sure you could freeze what you don't use. So that's kind of one little idea for how to use up what is sitting on your counter. And it's a nice change of scenery for an omelet, instead of, you could add leftover spinach, right? If you had that, you could do that. But have you ever done that before with the slow roasted tomatoes?
I have not, but you are absolutely making me want to try it. It sounds delicious.
I did a Facebook Live the other day where I showed people how to slow roast tomatoes and also how to roast radishes, because when you buy radishes, you buy a bunch. And that's a lot of radishes. I mean, how many radishes can anybody eat? And so I did this Facebook Live, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And I show people how to roast radishes. Heavenly. So good. I love it.
They're delicious. Yeah, actually, one of my really good friends just taught me how to roast radishes, and I haven't done it myself, but tried her cooking, and it blew me away. The taste is so much different. The spiciness kind of is a little bit lower, but the sweetness really comes out of the radishes when you roast them.
And did you notice that they were really juicy as well?
Yeah, almost like a cooked potato in a way.
Yeah, it's just, I'll tell people how to do it because, you can go watch the Facebook Live too, but all you do is you take radishes and you scrub them clean, dry them, trim them, and then cut them in half, and then place them cut side down on a foil-lined baking sheet. But before you do that, again, pop them in a bowl, toss them with a little bit of olive oil. I use extra virgin, and then kosher salt, black pepper. And then you can add herbs. You could chop up rosemary. You could chop up thyme. Those are sort of my two go-to herbs when I'm roasting veggies. And then those halved radishes go cut side down on that foil-lined baking sheet. And then in the oven they go. Now here's the secret. Your oven needs to be at 450 degrees. It seems really high, but you're only going to roast the radishes for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then when you pull them out, flip them over, you'll see that the cut side that was down is sort of this golden brown. Let those radishes cool just a little bit because, they're going to be really hot, and then pop them in your mouth and eat them like candy. And they're sweet, they're juicy. It's totally my favorite thing for summer.
That is so easy.
Yeah. It's literally just a couple minutes, and they cook up. Sometimes veggies in the oven take a while. The slow roasted tomatoes, 3 hours. The radishes, 12 minutes.
Wow. Yep.
I love it.
That's great.
So let's move on to your last tip. And again, I'm going to, in the show notes, there's so many ways to cut back on food waste, and we just sort of touched on a few. And I'd love to hear from you guys, listeners, please, if you're in the podcast posse, come on over and share your best tips for sure. But you talk, Chris, about eating a more biodiverse diet. Now, this was sort of new to me. When I think about eating sustainably, I get the plant protein thing. I get the food waste thing. But explain this concept of eating a more biodiverse diet.
This is something that may not be as apparent to most people, but biodiversity loss is one of our planetary boundaries that is in the alarming zone. Scientists around the world are noting that the amount of species lost in both plant and animal kingdom is unparalleled to any time that we've ever seen. So it's more important now than ever to promote biodiversity. And we have the ability to do that by choosing biodiverse foods. It's pretty simple. Obviously, the more biodiverse foods we eat, we're promoting different types of agriculture versus if we're just eating the same fruit and the same vegetable for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we're not really promoting that biodiversity. And the research shows that agriculture is the number one reason that biodiversity is lowering because we're kind of eating a really standard diet that's based with, corn, soy, and wheat being kind of the predominant base. And it's like, how do we break out of that and try the plethora of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes that are available? And the best way to do that is just to buy them and eat them.
So if you eat a more varied diet, then farmers will grow more varied crops. And do those crops accomplish different things? So different bugs, healthy, happy bugs, but different bugs, different birds, different butterflies. Is that where it all sort of ties in, or they put different nutrients back into the ground? Is that the piece that kind of connects to this eating sustainably concept?
Absolutely. The easiest way to think about it is that our bodies are an ecosystem. There's many moving parts of our body that keep it functioning, healthy, and happy. And planet is no different. It needs a wide variety of species, insects, bugs, plants to maintain balance and order. And right now, it is actually becoming out of balance. So this is a really effective way that consumers like you and me can make a difference in our everyday lives.
Makes sense. Now, what about this whole idea of eating locally? Because, I live in New England, and in the winter, if I had to eat only foods grown locally, I would not be eating a lot of foods. And I'd really have to have sort of a root cellar where I was canning and, keeping foods throughout the season. But do you think it's okay then for us to eat a varied diet, consuming foods from around the world? I mean, you say eat a biodiverse diet. That means I want to eat foods that are coming from different places, right? The more variety, we kind of have to go outside of our geographical zone.
I recently was teaching a class at the University of Washington, and this really sunk home for me when I was learning about local diets and local foods. And while local foods can have some really good benefit to the small farmers and the local economy, overall, local foods aren't that much more environmentally sustainable. The transportation sector, i.e., shipping the foods from, point A to point B, the transportation sector only makes up a tiny sliver of the food's footprint. And oftentimes that is much, much less large than, the production, the energy that goes into producing the food and growing the food. Transportation is actually very small. So local foods are a great way to support small farms, local farms, by any means not necessary for us to only consume local foods. It's really important for us to consume biodiverse foods because that way we're getting phytonutrients and phytochemicals, vitamins and minerals from a wide variety of sources, which we can't really get if we're eating the same foods over and over again.
Got it. So if somebody wants to become an ethical food warrior today, after listening to this show, is there one big thing they can do today to start their journey to make a positive impact, to lower our carbon footprint? What would that be?
If I had to boil this down to just one task, I would say just to be more mindful of the amount of food that you throw away. Food waste is, in my opinion, the lowest hanging fruit and the easiest thing for all of us to do to reduce our environmental footprint. As you said, 40% of food in America gets thrown away, and the majority of that happens in our own kitchens and while we're eating out. It's the consumers that are throwing away the biggest portion of this food. So if we can take steps every single day to be more mindful of the amount of food that we eat and the amount of food that we don't eat, that can make a huge difference collectively across the country and across the world.
And is overeating a form of food waste? Because Americans do like to overeat, as we know.
We very much do. And yeah, our average calorie intake is much higher than the recommended average calorie intake. And I do believe that overeating is a form of food waste in that we're eating more than we need. And we're also doing harm to our bodies and that we're providing too many calories and excess nutrition. So yes, I do believe that overeating is a form of food waste, just like throwing away food in the trash can.
So Chris, something I like to ask my guests every week, and this is a departure now, but sort of not a departure from sustainable eating. But if you could put one cookbook on the bookshelf, and maybe it's not a cookbook, but a food book, but if there's one book people can put on their bookshelf if they want to eat more sustainably, what would it be?
I love the Waste-Free Kitchen Handbook. It's a guide to eating well and saving money by wasting less food. And this was written by Dana Gunders, who works for the Natural Resource Defense Council in San Francisco. And she really has been a spearhead for the food waste movement across America. She's written white papers and, given talks. And now she has a brand new cookbook out. It just came out, I think, over a year ago. And it really explains to consumers how we can be more conscientious users of food and how we can incorporate food into our recipes so that way it doesn't go to waste. So I'm a huge fan of that book.
Okay, good to know. And then finally, is there a chef or a cookbook author out there who you really admire? So, you're sitting on a park bench, this chef, this cookbook author happens to sit down next to you and it really makes your day. Who is it?
This might be an untraditional answer, but I don't know if you've heard of Leanne Brown. She is the author of Good and Cheap, Eating Well on $4 a Day. And in my previous role, I used to work as a nutrition manager at the Greater Cleveland Food Bank, and I worked predominantly with very low-income clients trying to just, make ends meet and eat healthy. And that's exactly what this book does. It's eating healthy food on less than $4 a day. And this is for anyone, anybody who's on a budget or just wants to eat healthier in a quick way. This book does a great job of explaining how to do that. And the reason why I particularly like this book is because Leanne Brown, you can buy it on Amazon in a paperback form, but you can also just download the PDF of this book for free. So that really eliminates most of the barriers that maybe low-income clients or maybe some people have for buying a new cookbook or trying new recipes. It really takes all the barriers out. So I would say if I could meet Leanne Brown, I would love to have a nice park bench conversation with her and thank her for her hard work.
Well, it's funny because on my last show, I had Sherry Coleman Collins talking about peanut allergy prevention, and she chose the same author that you just chose.
Get out. Wow.
And it's Leanne, right? I think I need to have her on the show. This is a sign. It is,
absolutely. You can tell her that two of your guests are big fans.
I will. I absolutely will. Well, Chris, anything else you want to share before we wrap it up today?
Oftentimes there's so much information about nutrition, about sustainable eating, about how to make a difference and how to be healthy for ourselves. And really, it does come down to just being mindful consumers, whether that's in food, whether that's in clothing, whether that's in anything. identifying and asking ourselves this question, do we need to be consuming, buying, purchasing this much? And how do we use what we have more responsibly and sustainably? And that's really the core of my message, is just being more mindful.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Chris Vogliano, for being on the show today.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for having me.
Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. That was a really great show, kind of packed with a lot of news you can use. I know myself, I'm going to be more mindful. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. And as always, I encourage everybody to head on over to Liz's Healthy Table, to the podcast page where you will find the notes from today's show. On the blog, you'll find my cheese omelet with slow roasted tomatoes. I'm going to give you a step-by-step for how to slow roast those tomatoes. And then, as always, I encourage you to follow me on social media, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter, and of course, Facebook. And until next time, thanks for listening to Liz's Healthy Table.